Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Jawad Dakhqan, Associate Director of Studio X Amman, a platform for experimental research in design, architecture, and the built environment that is run by Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and the Columbia Global Centers in Amman. I would like to welcome you to the third webinar of Emergency Urbanism, Infrastructure, and Cities series. In this series, speakers will reflect on urban adaptation and mitigation action plans that are in place to tackle the urban challenges that cities are currently facing. They will discuss how global agendas can be reconciled with the communities, cities, and the nation's needs to pave pathways for sustainable development, as well as what they envision for the future of cities and urban life. The series is bringing together experts to discuss what is required to avert the indirect sociocultural impact that may result when urban life is interrupted. What city recovery strategies centered on inclusive and sustainable models are needed to address such challenges, and what are the lessons learned from previous work on urban resilience in terms of digitalization, mobility, density, urban design, collaborative governance, and action-oriented guidance to build better cities. The first two webinars explored how cities have responded to environmental disasters and disease outbreaks, and investigated the interventions required to mitigate the effects of such emergencies. As for today's webinar, Digital Information, Mapping Tools and Planning, the panel discussion will explore the role of technology, data, and mapping tools used today to help planners, municipalities, governments, citizens identify the neighborhoods most vulnerable to viruses and emergencies in general. Technologies such as urban planning tools, mapping techniques expose issues detrimental to communities and ecology, like the lack of access to essential services and its correlation to higher infection rates. The panelists will investigate how digital infrastructure and information is utilized in response to managing pandemics and emergencies. They will discuss citizens' engagement in shaping their built environment, highlighting the tools used to access services and the effectiveness of such tools. Before we begin, I want to thank our panelists and respondents for agreeing to participate in today's discussion. I would also like to thank my colleagues at the Columbia Global Centers Amman, Rio, and Istanbul for their input and their partnership on this series. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists and respondents for today's webinar. I'll start with our first speaker for today, Leah Meister. Leah is an urbanist, GIS methodologist, and an assistant professor at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. Broadly, her research engages concurrent issues of spatial justice, informational ethics, and the effects of infrastructural networks on the construction of social and political space. Her current research explores the ways in which digital technologies and cartographies impact urban spatial politics and altering methods of research. I'll move on to our second speaker for today's webinar, Michael Krisch. Michael is the Deputy Director of the Brown Institute for Media Innovation, a bi-coastal research institute at Columbia Journalism School and Stanford Engineering. At the institute, Krisch serves as an advisor to research and grants. He also is a lead instructor of Points Unknown, a GIS-based curriculum that is implemented through workshops at Columbia Journalism School and as an advanced spatial design course in the Graduate School of Architecture at Columbia University. In addition to teaching and advising, Krisch leads Mapping Local News, a research project in partnership with the Lenfest Institute and the Philadelphia Inquirer, aimed at building machine learning-based tools to help newsrooms analyze equity and representation in their work at scale. And our third speaker for tonight will be Omar Tisdel. Omar is an associate professor of geography at Birzeit University and principal investigator of Makaniyat, a research group in Ramallah, Palestine. His research focuses on agroecological and landscape change. He conducts extensive field research on agrobiodiversity, the built environment, and the polycultural production systems. With colleagues in his research group, he also works to conserve wild food plants. Recent articles have appeared in Plants, People, Planet, Frontiers in Plant Science, Journal of Arid Environments, and Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems. With the research collective, he edited an open science guide to Palestinian wild food plants in 2018. He holds a PhD in geography and sustainable agriculture from the University of Minnesota. Last but not least, our respondent for this event, Laura Kugel, who is a great friend and a colleague and a mentor. Laura is a professor of architecture at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation at Columbia University, where she directs the Center for Spatial Research and the Visual Studies curriculum. She is the author of Close Up at a Distance, Mapping, Technology and Politics, and co-editor of Ways of Knowing Cities. From 2004 through 2015, she founded and directed the Spatial Information Design Lab at GSAP. Her work explores the ethics and politics of digital mapping and its technologies, the art, science, and visualizations of big and small data and design environments for public engagement with maps and data. Now, before we start with the presentations, starting with Leah, before handing it over to you, I would like to remind you all to submit your questions through Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We will try to get as many questions as we can. And thank you again to everyone in our virtual audience for being with us. And please join me in welcoming Leah Meister. Over to you, Leah.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Jawad and the Columbia Global Centers for having me. I'm Leah Meister, as Jawad said, assistant professor at Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. I am giving an appropriate amount of pause before I start sharing my screen for later video editing purposes. And for everybody else, that's what's going to happen. That is this manufactured delay that I think is now safe. Okay. With that, I'll start sharing my screen. I'm going to try very briefly with 10 or so minutes. I think that's more or less enough time to very quickly make 3 overarching points and include some 3 examples or references that others can look toward beyond this discussion. Hopefully, I'll lay some groundwork. I think Michael and Omar will be diving a little bit deeper into specific case studies. And everything I'm going to talk about, more or less talks about, involves planning, especially governmental planning, thinking about informational infrastructures broadly. And by that, we can sometimes talk about the hard infrastructures of information and data, the ICT infrastructures, the built infrastructures. Today, I'm going to speak mostly toward the social and political infrastructures, the sort of institutional and organizational systems involved, and how information cooperates, the systems that allow information to flow through governance and decision-making processes especially, and how we plan those before an emergency, sometimes thinking about emergency ahead of time. They get tested severely within emergencies. Again, those political and social infrastructures or components in particular, and then always they're changed by emergency, sometimes in that moment in crisis. Those infrastructures can be temporarily or sometimes irrevocably shifted, which of course carries consequences. And so I'm just going to broadly talk about these sort of 3 areas that have been on my mind for the last year, especially, but reemerge with every new crisis, with every new emergency faced by cities, regions, and governments of all scales. So my first example comes from, and again, if you want to dive into this, I suggest reading it, comes from Ben Green in his research for the Smart Enough City, talks about an outbreak in New York City of Legionnaire's disease in early, I think, 2015, and through 2014 and 2016, in response, the lessons learned from that outbreak, right? I'm actually gonna read from Green here. We can certainly predict the types of problems that will arise and the challenges that will accompany the use of data. Those problems include poorly managed data sets that are inaccurate or incomplete, a lack of data fluency throughout departments, and the inability to synthesize information across data sets. So we're talking about sharing, we're talking about interoperability, we're talking about a kind of digital translation between agencies, between departments, all of the kind of coordinated efforts that are required in an emergency setting. But these are not at their core technology problems, right? But to use technology effectively, they must be addressed. So essentially, in order for informational infrastructures within government to work in the moment that you need to work, have them work, planning needs to be done ahead of time. He's making this case for those crises. And so in response and thinking through the lessons learned from this Legionnaire's disease outbreak in 2015, the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics here took a cue from the Office of Emergency Management's playbook and started thinking through their digital and data preparedness the way that emergency management preparedness is planned, developing what they call data drills, using scenario planning exercises, and starting to invest in the individuals, invest in the people involved in these infrastructures to ensure that digital systems and data sharing systems and the analytics required could work when they were needed. Another example, but perhaps less optimistic, but nonetheless something that's been on my mind, is the way in which, of course, these infrastructures, we're not only talking about data sharing within government systems, but we're also, especially in emergencies, talking about information sharing publicly from government to people, to citizens, to communities. There are plenty of examples of where this has faltered in the last year, and plenty of examples in the way in which these systems are subject to political influence and mismanagement, either by default or by design. What we're seeing here in this example, this is from the state of Georgia in the United States, the Department of Public Health. The two columns on the right of the screen, you're looking, the public health website had a daily updated dashboard, interactive maps describing the scenario in Georgia county by county of new COVID cases, either in raw numbers or cases per 100,000 people. And for days and days, for weeks, these maps seemed not to change. The highest concentrations stayed in the same places. And this is if you look carefully. I'm showing a few screenshots from 1 week, but you'll notice even from one day to the next, these legends changed, right? And kept the colors and this alarmist red in one place. In the cases by county, if you're not familiar, that's the Atlanta region. And so the legends and how the color coding worked were changed every day, and the situation seemed static. Right. After public pushback, the site was disabled. It was down for a week. And when it reemerged, we got an image like the one on the left, starting to show, in this case, you're looking at the cases over the previous 2 weeks. This is from 1 week later. If the bottom row, we're looking at July 25th, 1 week later on the 31st, we could see where the concentrations of cases had grown in the previous 2 weeks. And of course, this is not an image reflected at all in the kind of daily maps that they were showing previously. And then one more, I'm trying to stay within time here, one more big picture question to think of, a little bit not as even less optimistic than the last one, but nonetheless important to raise. And I think Michael will hopefully give us some talk about opportunities forward here. But I do want to call out, because it's been weighing heavily on my mind for the last year, especially the ways that emergencies, and a pandemic is certainly an instance of this, are used in an emergency situation where our infrastructures are tested heavily, regardless of their form. Our informational infrastructures get tested and their weaknesses are often exploited, right? Or the emergency calls for changes to our norms because of the scale and the scope and the severity of the need. And in this case, we've seen throughout 2020 increased levels of surveillance that individuals are comfortable with because we need that kind of protection that comes with the monitoring, right? We want to ensure, we want to understand the state of play, and we're willingly giving up sometimes certain civil liberties or submit ourselves to surveillance and tracking for the sake of the public good. There's plenty written on this, so few references. The Ada Lovelace Institute has been doing a lot of work on this. There's also a recent publication out on data justice and COVID-19 global perspectives. You can see both of those on the screen that start, and we're having a conversation about those trade-offs, right? One thing I would say, again, if we go back to the first example or case study or reference, we might then start to think about what kinds of cues we can take from other forms of emergency management and infrastructural planning. In many cases, we think about putting parameters around states of emergency, understanding that there are sometimes momentary and temporary changes that need to be made, but that when we do that, we're willingly engaging in those trade-offs, knowing that that state of emergency will have to be declared over at a certain point rather than living with those changes in perpetuity. We've seen it in the US. We can think, 9/11 brought about the Patriot Act, and many of those data practices are still in place. And we want to think about how we limit or how we protect ourselves, not just in the moment of an emergency, but in the moments that follow when we finally get through this. Those are my 10 minutes of some big picture thoughts to share. Hopefully we can engage a little bit more specifically. I think I hand it to Michael now.
Yes, thank you, Leah. Thank you for the presentation, and apologies for kind of giving a short amount of time for all of the speakers. Maybe now we can invite Michael for your presentation.
Thanks, Jawad. Yeah, thank you, Leah. That was great. And thank you, Jawad, for the invitation to join this conversation. I'm really excited to be here, and I look forward to having a conversation following all of our presentations. My name is Michael Krisch. I'm the Deputy Director and Associate Research Scholar at Brown. We are a research organization housed half at Columbia Journalism School, half at Stanford Engineering. And we really focus on doing research at that intersection of storytelling and technology. And the majority of our work is very data oriented. At Brown, I advise on research, I teach, and I lead a couple projects that are focused on mapping and journalism, which is what I'm going to speak on today. Okay, great. So today I'm going to speak about research pertaining to news deserts and some of the projects that we're building and how they relate to the current crisis that we're experiencing. So this is the Brown Institute at Columbia, and in full disclosure, I'm not an architect, I'm not a planner, I'm not a designer. I am very much a journalist working as a researcher at a journalism school, and I'm excited to be the black sheep on this panel because I think I have a little more latitude to talk on topics that are outside a typical panel, and hopefully you find it relevant and interesting. But for that reason, I'm going to give a little background on the project so that there's some context for you to think about. So news deserts, what are they? So news deserts are this idea that emerged in the 2000s, and it really started out as an idea that there are growing areas of our country, and I apologize, this is very US centric, although a lot of these things are happening around the world. So news deserts are being felt around the world, but the examples I'll show today are very US based. So news deserts started out as this concept that there are growing areas of the country that are no longer in what they deem as like a service area of a newspaper. So in other words, when local newspapers fold, so does local coverage of these areas. Thankfully, this definition has expanded dramatically and is now much more focused on communities and not so strictly like bound to geographies that are being reported on. This is a map that highlights news deserts. There's a group out of UNC that focuses very much on this specific topic, and they have a lot of amazing research. But the important thing to know is that just within the last 15 years, our country has lost around 1,800 local news organizations, which is just, it's a shocking statistic. And so to those outside the journalism community, like, why is this a significant point? And there are a couple of reasons that local news is so integral to how we understand crises and how we adapt to the current conditions on the ground. So for one, local news serves the community with critical information. This is just an anecdote of Flint and how the Flint water crisis was really born out of local reporting, but it expands to basically all of the crises that we talk about in smaller communities and smaller cities. It's also a building block for social cohesion. One of the very critical aspects of local news is that it drives civic engagement. When I talk about civic engagement, direct correlations between things like voter habits and voter behaviors are tied to having a local paper. It also serves as a watchdog for corporate accountability. I think this specific example that I show from a research study is just fascinating. When a consumer goods plant's toxic emissions receive newspaper coverage, the plant reduces emissions by an average of 29% compared with plants that do not receive coverage. These are just like shocking things that take place across the country and around the world. And having local news to be able to hold these places accountable is important. These other 2 points, it's an antidote to political polarization. And I think the last one, which is actually from a 2001 article from the journal Urban Studies, which is probably more relatable to this audience. Local news is a lens in how communities see themselves and see others. And that's the area that really drove our research project. I'm going to skip this in order for time. So with the framing of local news, I want to highlight a project that we've been working on at Brown, which is called Mapping Local News. And it really starts out through this framing from a study done in 2009 from April Lindgren. This was a study of the Toronto Star, and it's a coverage audit that looked at 28 issues of the newspaper, and researchers manually annotated articles found within these 28 issues and tried to basically map them and see how coverage compared across geographies based on things like topic, so crime or business, to things like sources, like what is the gender breakdown of a source. And how can we build on this work? Major advances in computation have been made, and we can leverage these to basically do that research at scale and automatically. So there's a partnership with the Lenfest Local Lab and the Philadelphia Inquirer, and our goal is to build an automated approach to identifying and mapping local news. So what does this look like? Here's an article. It's about a donut shop opening in Philadelphia. We need a little bit of light material every now and again in news. So I'm going to start with just framing through this article. In the first couple of sentences, we have a couple locations. Here we see Chestnut Hall. We see 3900 Chestnut Street, 39th Street between Chestnut and Sansom Streets. These are locations in Philadelphia. And this points out the exact technical challenge that we're looking at. For a reader, these are like extremely easy to understand and make sense of, but for a computer to actually analyze these and understand these as locations is quite challenging. And here's why. These are leading NLP libraries, natural language processing libraries. In row A, we have this original sentence extracted. In row B, we have Spacey, which is an open source NLP library acting on this. And it's using named entity recognition, so it's identifying different things within the sentence. People, what they deem as GPEs, which are geopolitical entities. They have quantities, and oftentimes these are actually incorrect. And then in row C, we have Stanford's NER tool, which is much better at location, but it's still failing, especially when we think about sending these off to actually get locations and be mapped. So we needed something new. So essentially what we were trying to do was understand how local news text is written and how can we identify locations. So when I talk about context, when we look at locations like this, if you say City Hall in a news article, anyone reading the news article understands what City Hall means. So if there is, let's say, a Capitol, riots at the Capitol, for us, when we read that, we understand exactly what they're talking about. But for a computer, it could be a capital of any place. And so once you actually try to identify and do geocoding based on that, it fails, and it fails pretty much every time. And when you expand upon that and you say things like 2 blocks north of the Capitol, that is almost impossible for a computer to do without some sort of training. So we needed something new, and we turned to machine learning. So we took a corpus of articles, we split those articles into sentences and identified sentences that we know to have locations in them. We then passed those to Mechanical Turk, which is a crowdsourcing engine, and we had people label the sentences. We took those sentences, trained BERT, which is a classification machine learning model from Google, and we trained it to basically identify these locations based on what Mechanical Turk was telling us. we then took hundreds of thousands of articles from the Philadelphia Inquirer and spit them through the machine learning model to extract locations and then map those very same locations. I'm probably not going to get into the details, just high level. We used 80,000 articles for the training. We combined a bunch of heuristics like rules to identify when specific things should be joined, like street names and addresses to address numbers. And we trained BERT, which is a Google model. So here we can look back at the performance both of these other NER tools or NLP tools versus our trained BERT model. And here in D, we can see things like Chestnut Hall or 3900 Chestnut Street or 39th Street between Chestnut and Sansom Streets are identified properly. So what do we do with that? So we take these locations and then we spit them back into an NLP tool, which splits them into two different categories, GPEs or geopolitical entities and non. And the non-GPEs get sent off to Google, which is very good at retrieving places. And the GPEs, which are like cities or states or counties, get sent off to OSM. And then we get all of the results back and put them on a map. So we built a very, very quick prototype. This was in about March of this past year, just for a newsroom to begin playing with it. And then COVID-19 hit. So we very quickly adapted and trying to figure out how we could apply our tool to do some good in Philadelphia. There's a great quote: "Coronavirus is revealing why local news is so important. It's also killing it. People need timely, unbiased information on local conditions in their communities more than ever." So essentially what we did was we organized all COVID coverage by county, built a newsletter on top of it, and very quickly it became the top hit across the Philadelphia Inquirer. And as soon as we finished building this tool, the murder of George Floyd happened. And so we decided to really pivot and start doing a much more intensive look at diversity, equity, and inclusion and how our tool might leverage exactly that. So one of the major takeaways was discrepancy in crime coverage, looking back at this April Lindgren study. So what we were trying to do was basically take that study and apply it through machine learning. So content audits at news organizations are rare, they're expensive. When people do them, the scale is really narrow, and they're dated as soon as the content audit is done. And by a small scale, I'm talking about 28 editions of a newspaper being the only audit you might have on a news organization for 30 years. That is just not an audit of the coverage of a local newspaper. So we've been expanding it. We've been doing photo assignments and building out the tool for other desks. We're also incorporating old tools that we've built that analyze gender across a story. And we're doing this all using human-in-the-loop machine learning so that people can see exactly how the tool is performing and where it's slipping up and how they can actually go in and improve what the results might be. And that is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, for the presentation. This is quite interesting to see how kind of you used all of those codes. Actually, I have lots of questions that maybe later on. Now we can move to our last speaker, Armand. So yours.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here with you. Thank you to Jawad and to Leah and Michael and Laura for the invitation and for these great presentations. So I teach at Birzeit University in the geography department, and I'll be talking about our work here in Palestine on agrobiodiversity and how we use mapping to basically and local knowledge to try to balance between these different scales and different views. So I'll just share my screen here. So I'm part of a research group which has been going now for 5 years called Makaniyat. And I like to think about our work as experimenting with open science and mapping, especially in the multiple kind of scales of crisis that we are working with. both political and also climate-based, which are of particular concern to us. These are kind of a couple of photos to give you a sense of the landscape where we work. So our research basically comes at the intersection of agrobiodiversity and landscape transformation. Working at the landscape scale, we try to understand the relationships between plants and people within the context of climate crisis. Makaniyat is from the Arabic makaniye. Makaniye is a spatiality in a sense in Arabic, but it comes from a whole family of words basically related to being, kaun, being, and makan, a place of being. Our group basically tries to work in these kind of deeply rooted local contexts where we then can publish and speak more broadly in the literature. So we have a few approaches which are kind of postures or positions in a sense. We try to give attention to land and plants and elders and their relationships especially. And this has become increasingly important, but also challenging in the context in where we work. We are deeply committed to free and open knowledge and collaboration, but this comes with costs, and this is a question that I'll bring up at the very end. Keeping landscape at the scale of our study and intervention, and of course, building fair and just agroecological systems. So we try to learn from the land, and I mean that by inhabiting the land and inhabiting the areas where we work in a very real way. So we spend a lot of time there, tours, but also collections. We collect a lot of plant material, and so the land, in a sense, is very real, and this is difficult. Sometimes as an academic or as a geographer, where we are very much working from a different position, which is a God's eye view of the world. So we really kind of dig down. These are colleagues of mine, Mary and Yusra. We also try to learn from elders, and in particular, elders, I think, in our work, enable us to give depth and context to data and to maps and to aerial photographs that is simply not possible otherwise. And of course, we try to learn from data and from maps. This is a World War I image that is a particular favorite of mine from the 2nd of July, 1918. By the Bavarian Air Force, flying over a village where happened to fly over a village 100 years ago where we were working 100 years later, and were able to extract all kinds of data from this map, but also spoke with elders from this village. And so this brings me to our first case study. We looked at rain-fed agroecosystems, trying to use open science to methodologies to try to unpack this situation. Our main research question, and this I think is at the heart of our work in a sense of what are the modes of persistence through crisis. I mean, that's kind of something that has always been a common thread in our work. And so we took a 100-year timescale for this particular study. And one of the ways we were able to do that is because of this 1918 image and a series of them, which we were able to obtain from archival sources in high resolution. Those were then georeferenced, and a whole series of them in the study area. We were able to cover a good bit of the study area with them, and then digitized and vectorized our main study area, which was an agricultural plain. And we were able to do this in a series of aerial images. And I'd like to just point out that it's very difficult for us to obtain images, both in terms of cost and in terms of where we're located in the world. It's quite difficult just because of the way that our institutions work, and also because of the ways that other institutions outside treat us and look at us. And so we then, working from these vectorizations, which we had done, began to compile a kind of a geodatabase of the area. And a particular proud moment was when we held a workshop with elders in this village, and were able to basically map out all of the traditional names for the areas within our study area, and we're able to roughly position them within our map. And this is a map that you see before you of these areas. Some of these villages have been destroyed, and others are deeply threatened. And this culminated in an article in 2018 in Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems. And that choice was very deliberate, because we wanted to actually speak within the agroecology world with our work, and so that was the goal, and we co-published that with the three of us authors there, and we're able to show the resilience of this particular agroecosystem over time, using mapping and interviews with elders as our main, with 23 elders as our main source. This developed after the article into an entire research engine, which we had custom developed with developers in Amman and friends elsewhere, where we started digitizing maps that we could get, aerial photographs which we could obtain. We're not often able to obtain images, as I said, because of the ways that we're positioned in the world. And this, but it has shown itself to be quite interesting. And the idea is, with this research engine, that we would enable research in Arabic, and also for our students, Birzeit University and other students in the Arab world who wouldn't normally have access to this kind of data. We also spent a lot of time digitizing historical sources, lists of plants, maps from the Orientalist period. There was a flourishing of kind of Orientalist writings about Palestine in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Many of those sources are now available in digital form, in addition to a kind of renaissance in the 1940s and 50s in Arabic, which we also were able to digitize. And all of that went into our research engine. So it allows visualization and management of data in both table form and as geodata. Our second case study is from an urban planning perspective. We were concerned about a green area within the urban space of Ramallah, which we've done a lot of work, and there are 3 or 4 environmental organizations based in that valley. And so we were able to work with them and work with community elders also to understand the kind of environmental history of this place, but also working from colonial era maps like the Survey of Western Palestine in the late 19th century. We were able to, and aerial photography from the 1940s, we were able to bring together these kinds of data and information to show that there was actually a pedestrian footpath in this area, and are now in the process of digitizing that footpath, both by walking the path with GPS, but also with digitizing from the colonial era maps and from the 1940s aerial photographs to actually lobby for the protection of this area as a trail, as a walking trail. So I'll just show you one small image of the terraces there in April. It's a particularly beautiful place. So the last thing I just wanted to bring up is that we were able to co-publish as a collective the first Arabic guide to wild food plants in Palestine, and it was a great challenge for a number of reasons. But it's freely available now on archive.org, and we've taken a stance that we will publish them on a Creative Commons license, our work on a Creative Commons license, anything that we publish locally here on a Creative Commons license. So this is community knowledge, it's people's knowledge, and we try to treat it accordingly. So these are just a few images from our events. And this culminated in 2020 with an article in the journal Varied Environments with a long list of authors, all of whom are collaborators here, where we work together, and collaborators in the United States, where we kind of envision an agroecosystem that is more just. I'd just like to end with a question or a paradox, and this is really a question for everyone here, and something that I've been thinking a lot about with colleagues, is that we have an open data posture, and we feel deeply about, we feel very strongly about that data should be open, but we're also very concerned about appropriation of data. And I know this is not a new question, but I would be interested to hear your thoughts about this. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Omar, for the presentation. I mean, nothing relevant, but every time I see a photo of people not wearing masks, I search for the masks, and now I'm trained to search for masks, and then I realized this was taken prior to COVID. Maybe now we'll invite Laura Kurgan, who started with a moderated discussion with the presenters, and hopefully I'm hoping really for an amazing discussion. And later on, we have the Q&A session. Some questions, we're receiving some questions, and hopefully we'll answer all of them. Thank you, Omar, again, and please, Laura. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. And thanks as well for the invitation. And I have the hardest task, of course, is bringing all these amazing things together. So first of all, it's such a pleasure because the three of you are talking exactly at the kind of problem I grapple with on a day-to-day basis, which is the limits of what we can do with the tools that we love to use and we love to make, right? And I think the three of you are all really involved in making new tools with existing tools and technologies. And that is, number one, a really hard thing to do if you're critical of the ways in which other people deploy these same tools. And you've all done this in such different ways. And so that's what I'm going to start with, because I think it actually, I don't know that it will pull them together, but maybe the three of you can make links. And so, Leah, the example I'm going to stick on, first of all, I love your thing about emergency, that, you plan before an emergency, but your tools are tested by emergency, and you're also changed, you are changed, and your tools are changed by the emergency. And that Georgia example is so brilliant. Like, who thought to keep Atlanta red by simply changing the legend of a map? I don't know. I didn't see that example anywhere. It's just such a brilliant form of lying, that then is so perfectly represented in this daily map on a public agency website. It's super astonishing, right? And then Michael, number one, I think you have, every word you used was spatial. It was so funny. Even like the news desert is actually comes from a food desert, which is very much urban planning. And so the way that you position your work is so easy for your engagement with architects, and also just the general notion of maps and data coming together, which the local news has to do because it's such a spatial concept. But I hadn't thought about that when you don't think in maps, but you think in language, and then you're trying to use natural language processing, which maybe people in this audience might not know what it is, but it's a way of analyzing texts for patterns using algorithms, right? So using mathematical formulas of some sort. And then the fact that a computer doesn't understand what the capital is. And when you think about that as a problem, which relates to so many things, because we use computers to learn patterns on a daily basis in so many ways, you know, even with the surveillance of networks and in terms of trying to make maps. But it's again just such a brilliant example that I wouldn't have thought of, and it points to the limitation of computation, and of course also of the fact that when you put a point on the map, if you look at it another way, from the spatial way, it might have the label, the capital, but still, right, even a spatial machine learning might not know what that means. So in both cases, humans, you know, the human in the loop, both in Leah's example and in your example, is so smart. And then that bleeds over into Omar's presentation, where the humans in the loop are the elders, right, of the people who have a memory, almost 100-year, they do have 100-year memory because they were told something by their relatives. And, you know, so that kind of human in the loop in terms of the understanding of the landscape, and your locality is the plants, and, you know, and herbariums are so under-digitized, actually. I've seen so many herbariums and things like that, which are still sort of handwritten, and there's a lot of people working on that problematic. But again, I think for people in the audience, I don't know how many people understand that you can't purchase a high-resolution satellite image if you're living in Palestine from an Israeli agency or from even, right, a US agency. Can you purchase a high-resolution image? No, still not. It's astonishing, right? But also, people in the audience might not know that you actually have to purchase a higher resolution satellite image in the first place, right? That even though what you think is so naturalized on Google Earth is not up to date, and that actually they're private companies where people are allowed to purchase Imagely, but there's still that politics, that limit, you know, and I think that that's your limit. You know, if Michael's limit was the fact that computers can't understand a contextual geography just with the word capital, whereas yours is a political one, right? Whereas Leah's is a deliberate lie on the part. So there's like these different forms of representation. And I think maybe that's the way that you can sort of have a discussion between yourselves as critical users of data. I just think this is such an amazing series of 3 talks about the use and abuse and the limits of representational systems, data, maps, etc. So, but maybe you have questions for each other, yeah, before we open it up.
Well, Laura, thank you. That was very generous, but also very well threaded. I think you found the links that I'm not sure all of us necessarily saw in the moment. So I appreciate that. And I think, I mean, it's, you didn't really raise a question, but that threading, I think, lets us also maybe start to address Omar's sort of paradox or set of questions by thinking through, or, you know, teasing out some of the thornier ethical considerations. There are some moments in information sharing where the ethics, I think, are very clear for all of us, that we know where the lines are drawn and there's nothing fuzzy or gray area or blurry about it. But it becomes harder when it isn't so blatant, when you're talking about like potentiality. I mean, Omar asked, you know, about you want to share, but how is that? It's the eventuality of how it gets used, which you can't control once shared, right? Yeah. That appropriated act. And I think it comes back down, at least in the way I've been thinking about this and sort of tracking and following spatial information use and data sharing through the COVID crisis, about, you know, we can't ever separate, at least in my own thinking, I can't separate the information itself or a set of data sources or data sets from communication, right? That if we consider those two different nouns, that are, and not always thinking about the relationship between the two, then we run into these paradoxes, and it becomes the communication of that information that is the information itself, whether that's like the Georgia mapping example, or asking about how tracking and surveillance information will later get used, and thinking about these eventualities, which is, I think, is a planning question. The temporal part of planning, like by its very definition, is future centered, and it's some attempt to think about and control something that hasn't happened yet, to be able to plan for that future or constrain those eventualities. And that's where I'm starting to come back to these examples of scenario planning, of playing out those possible case studies and asking yourself what you would do and what you can do now to prepare for that, or to place limits on it, and to understand that there's a kind of ideal about sharing, for instance, but then how would that information get used, whether it's by a government, whether it's by private entities, and coming back to this, like the making of tools question, staying sort of locked in the register, staying locked in the processes that produce the information itself, to produce information that, if shared, when shared, kind of maintains, as whether it's metadata systems or structures or otherwise, kind of maintains that protection against misappropriation, or turning where tools for decision making can later get turned post-emergency into like tools for targeting, is
like for example, I think the Parler example right now of the releasing of the metadata of where all the videos have been uploaded. If we had been thinking of that with Justice for George, we would have been appalled, right? And so there's that. But Michael, I was curious, is your project, is it based in Philadelphia? Like when you were saying the Philadelphia Inquirer, so when you were talking about the counties, you were talking about in Pennsylvania, right? It hasn't gone across the USA, your current example.
Yeah, so currently we're building with the Philadelphia Inquirer as our case study, simply because it's the largest local news organization with a huge amount of historical reporting dating back to the 1800s. So there's just a huge archive to draw on. And we also have researchers that we can engage with on a technical level embedded within the newsroom. And having, I think the thread that you drew, which is that community engagement is like critical to understanding the creation and use of data sets, I think applies for all of these discussions. And in the instance of what our work is doing, having an editor who can answer very obvious questions that we see when we see a trend on the map, we can draw a very simple conclusion very quickly, but oftentimes the editor will debunk that in a second. So with the crime reporting example, in the Toronto Star study, they found all of this crime reporting that was happening right next to the city hall, and no one could make sense of it until they talked to an editor and they said, well, yeah, that's where all of the crime reports come out of. That's where the main police precinct is. So of course you're going to see that. And so there are these errors errors in the trends that we identify that oftentimes have very simple explanations from the community who can put context to it.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. And Omar, if you had to collaborate with an organization outside of Palestine, could you then purchase an image?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is possible. What I think increasingly these digitized archives are coming online with large repositories in Europe and US. So it's increasingly more possible to buy his archival imagery or to
but not current. But
current is much more difficult.
Right. I mean, I really loved the 100-year span, which is common to all your case studies. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, did that get derived from the data? I mean, obviously it came from the data set, and yeah.
Yeah, it came from the data set, and I think it was, I mean, it was like, you know, striking gold, because finding that image, you know, out of so many, was just an amazing moment. And then for me in particular, I mean, talking about appropriation and getting back to Leah and Michael's interventions, I think that, you know, there's also levels of appropriation and reappropriation that, you know, are definitely possible here. And those are, you know, those are literally reconnaissance photos from a military, you know, 100 years ago. But they are also incredibly rich sources of information for people here, who can use them to understand how life was lived and how their place looked. And I think one of the things we need to try to kind of get a grip on increasingly is to try to figure out ways where we are combining these kinds of sources. And one of my concerns with my own, you know, turn to more and more digital information and to data is that we often, this kind of localized understanding, community understanding that lies in a community newspaper or elsewhere, is being lost, and those are such precious kind of forms of knowledge that that I think are needed more and more as we turn to these other points of view of looking at data from our computer screens. And it was really fascinating to do workshops with people and say and hear the different, you know, interpretations of their place. And I think that gets to the question that also Michael was talking about. You know, it's this human touch of understanding a place.
Yeah. It seems to be Majid. I think that's Majid from Open Palestine Maps, is saying that that there was an amendment change to allow for higher resolution. So that's good.
It was very recent, I think.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah, one paper I would point to, which I just find to be such a good crutch for having some of these conversations, is data sheets for data sets. It was led by the Google researcher that was recently fired, Timnit Gebru. And it really addresses this idea that the machine learning community has no standardized process for documenting data sets. And so things like the motivation of a data set, its composition, its collection, the processing, pre-processing, cleaning, like all of the labeling that takes place, how it gets used, how it gets distributed, like all of these issues get addressed and at least opened as a conversation. And I think that really has helped, at least the work that we've done on our side, just guide some of the questions that we need to be asking before we even start building a model or looking at a data set.
Right.
And I assume that holds true for a lot of the folks here.
Yeah. Right, just knowing, I don't know who is in the audience and whether most people are from Amman, but you know, we have two people on this panel who are from the United States and are used to having access to huge amounts of data, to open data, to census data, to GIS data. And I know a little bit about Amman, that it's actually the total opposite, where it's not that easy to get access to a GIS data set, and likely the same in Palestine. So we're also dealing with very different situations of access to data. I'm wondering, I'm just trying to expand on the conversation a little bit to maybe some problems that either, you know, any of you might have had in that regard.
Well, again, as one of those people in the United States who's used to having tons of authoritative governmental data at her fingertips, I think one of the starkest impacts of political influence in the current, in one of the current emergencies, and its impacts on the sort of informational infrastructures we've got here even, is that we've started to, we can see from lots of examples, the way that the quantity of high quality information we're used to having has been distorted or degraded, or has either we've lost the availability due to political influence to access that information, or the information that we have had access to has been much lower fidelity, much less trustworthy. And so I think, again, well, like on one hand, we're used to that, and we're in the last year especially becoming a little bit more facile, I think, at adapting our data practices and our like healthy skepticism of the information we do have, and a little bit more resourceful, and whether it's community engagement, data collection practices, or otherwise, like people are having to become a little bit more resourceful in order to find quality information. And I think that also speaks to Michael's point about local news coverage and its recent history in the US. But we're also, on the other end of the spectrum, whether it's the US is a lot like several other places or regimes on the planet, especially in terms of private sector information regimes. Because on one hand, we have like sort of governmental data sets that are available. On the other hand, we know that massive private sector data sets are constructed and extracted and monitoring, right? To which none of us have ready, easy access, right? And that again, those are being used both to facilitate decision making, but also being used for targeting. Yeah. And so there's a kind of weird interplay that I think researchers can share data difficulty experiences, although the sources, whether it's governmental or private sector, is a little bit different based on context.
Yeah, it's a really good point.
I would expand on the case of Amman or Jordan, basically, in terms of accessibility of data. On one hand, it is accessible, but it takes time to access such data because it takes time and lots of correspondence. It depends on where you're coming from, basically, which institution, whom do you represent, and why you're using this data. Most of the GIS data was at the geographical center, which was mainly operated by the army. So I think 15, 20 years ago, I'm not exactly sure when was the time that it became accessible. This information became accessible, more accessible, I would say, to researchers, to students. But again, you have the process of kind of accessing the data. Sometimes it's quite difficult. Then you hit another bump, which is it's expensive. But again, depending on the depth of the information. But the third, which is the most important, is understanding the data collection practices. Because sometimes you get the data, but you don't understand how it's collected or when it was collected and the accuracy of it. And right at the time of when now is like during emergencies, let's say, when you want to acquire data at a short amount of time in order to kind of respond, in order to kind of project how we can move forward, it might seem almost impossible, I would say, because now data would be not that accessible, because now the government on its own, whether the municipality, the geographical kind of a GIS center, are trying to understand how can they collect data more efficiently and more accurately. Those were conversations that I had with people in the municipality, which they are still now asking themselves, how do we get through this? On one hand, getting the data is something, but at a pace which is now we're facing much more and more emergencies. So how do we do this? This is a question that I've been asking myself. They've been asking themselves actually, and then hopefully we'll reach somewhere.
Right, great. Okay, there's two comments over here. The one which you should all read about the presentation, and others sort of saying, yes, this is the accessibility problem is common in this part of the world. But there's a question over here, and it says, past knowledge is captured in human memories and newspapers, do the panelists think that despite current restrictions on data information, we're actually now in a better place as researchers, since our current data sets information flow more freely in digital form? The question is here, can you see it? Can you? Yeah. I think maybe you would each have a different answer to this. I'm not sure information is that much more free, but.
Yeah, I can start.
Okay.
Just with an anecdote of taking perhaps the best known news organization in the world, the New York Times. They've been digitizing their archive, which is obviously just an enormous task in and of itself. And they quickly realized that the scope was too large to digitize. So they are just doing the first paragraph, or this might be an outdated anecdote because I haven't seen the recent efforts, but they were just digitizing the very first paragraph of each story because it was too large of a lift to digitize the entire archive. And I think from one perspective, this is exactly what Lee's question is exactly right. Like, we are in a much better place because we can get a massive scale of data, but at the same time, there are limitations to what that data represents. We have a project right now it's called Documenting COVID-19, and it places freedom of information requests to state and local governments around the United States. For any time officials use the term coronavirus, COVID-19 in text messages or emails. And we've gotten back terabytes of scans of emails and text messages, but they're not actionable data, right? It requires a researcher to develop a tool that extracts certain entities, and to try and actually grab knowledge from these is an incredibly huge lift. So I do think we are in a much better place, but we are still in a very, very big fight to make sense of all of the data that we do have access to.
A really good point. The knowledge gained is harder. Yeah.
Omar, do you want to?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think it in a way, we have the ability also to produce. I mean, one of the things that we've been working on is actually being the archivists. In a sense, we're producing the data, and in a way that in the raw form, and so that presents its own challenges. But it also, I think today the opportunity is so much more than it has been in the past, where in digital form, in the production of data sets, from interviews and conducting interviews, from vectorizing aerial images, we're able to produce data sets that are actionable in a way that, obviously all data sets come with interpretation, but we clearly curate them in a particular way so that they are actionable, as Michael said, and that to me presents both challenges, but also great opportunities to actually lay out data that we want students to use, graduate students to use, other researchers, and so making that available in a way that is usable is kind of where we've been trying to focus some of our energy. But again, it presents great challenges in terms of appropriation, which is something that is a great concern for us.
I think the only thing I would add to that, I mean, I agree. We are in a better place than historically, especially with access to and control of versus control of information. Also, the ability to self-produce, self-represent through data, and allow communities to do that, or allow the information about them to be produced by them, and therefore it's like sort of self-determined decisions made or influence decision made with those data sets. And so in that regard, we're certainly in a better place. the arena that I think, and this is a personal, like, sort of academic bias, because this is where I work mainly, and where I teach mainly, would be on where we haven't made as much progress, where it's, especially now with the quantity of information available, would be on methodologies that also allow for that same self-determination or self-representation. The more, the bigger those data sets become, the greater in number they become, the more we're relying on computational techniques, algorithmic techniques that are laden, if not, with assumptions and perspectives about how the world works. Right, like every algorithm that looks at comparisons and relationships between data sets, those are all just proxies for a worldview of like how, those data sets represent certain things happening. We've got opinions about the relationship between those things happening, and then we mathematicize those relationships. And those different communities have different perspectives and different experiences of the relationships between stuff represented as data. And we haven't been great yet at operationalizing those differences in perspectives or experiences into the computational techniques, into the algorithms, into the math, and like beyond visualization. I'm struck by there's a lot of work being thought in for whether it's critical race spatial analysis or indigenous mapping practices, where we think about the fact that we can visualize inequities, we can visualize the effects of structural conditions, but the techniques that we use to do that are themselves not emancipatory, are themselves not actionable, and we might be able to produce other kinds of images and maps and findings, if it's an academic research question, if the methods themselves also represented the worldview of the people they're trying to describe, or the peoples they're trying to describe or work with. And we're in the baby phases of that. I think we're in a much better place, and we're getting even more equitable in terms of data productions and what the data set may or may not represent and how it's made. But then what happens with that data and how we analyze it, we're only starting, I think.
Yeah.
Leah, what do you think that computation can borrow from the research around bias within simply drawing a map when we think about the advancement of algorithms and computation?
I think positionality is the starting point, right? Even if a super dumb example, like really just off the top of my head, classes started this week. I teach an advanced spatial methodology seminar, and it's like one of the topics that my students have to work through as a really straightforward example. Most segregation indices that are used when mapping segregation are themselves aspatial, or they're several decades old, and those indices were written by people in a position of power and privilege, and the math behind those indices assume segregation, right? So they're really looking at levels like proportions of different community groups, and the assumption of those equations is segregation, or they're binary, and they're not able to sort of accommodate very diverse populations as a premise, mm-hmm. Right? That it would be one dominant group and other is the worldview behind that math. And there are plenty of others, but we're getting there. Yeah. And the more complexly we want to acknowledge, or the more willing we are to acknowledge the complexity of our spaces and of our societies, the more complex our math will get. And that's where computational power that we have that we didn't have before becomes opportunity.
Right. So many of the algorithms that are common in network science have a history in
exactly.
presuming racism, and mm-hmm. The CSR has written a few articles about that as well. But I wonder, should I read this comment, because I think this comment relates to some of this politicization of data. So, and maybe it's a I don't know how much longer you want to go on, Jawad, but this could be a good place to end. Thank you for your presentations. I remembered a story recorded in March 2020 as part of an independent ethnographic research. It was a justification for why people from rural areas in Egypt tend to deliver their symptomatic children to the hospital and just run away themselves. A man in his 70s told me, and I quote, "It is all about transmission of information in different communities. In cities, the educational systems, the media, and the internet are the main tool of information transmission. In rural areas, it is the inherited story. People from rural areas carry the trauma of cholera in the 1940s, when whole villages with outbreaks were locked down by the military until everybody died. Hence, the younger generations inherited the mistrust of the government. Thank you all for putting the stories, creating and sharing knowledge in a theoretical and local context from around the world." But I think this comment relates to some of the things Omar was talking about as well, this inherited trauma.
I think we can end it on this, unless Omar, you want to add something.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say, I mean, I think what I heard from Leah and from Michael today, and thank you to Laura, but I for pointing this out, you know, is that we have a moment now where there's a certain geographic scale that is becoming more and more, I mean, different geographic scales that are becoming more important, especially in local scale, you know, local scales of action and of analysis. And it's a fascinating moment, because this is it's what the pandemic is opening up to us is helping us realize what we probably always knew, you know. And with the ways that the information is used, the local level becomes a whole different area of action. You know, the local scale is a different field of action than a global scale.
Yeah, I really do think that's what's common. Yeah.
I want to thank you all. Thank you so much. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Omar, Laura, and Michael, for this interesting discussion. And thank you for accepting the invitation. And also want to thank everyone in our virtual audience for being with us. Before we end this, I just want to remind everyone that this webinar is part of an ongoing series, and we hope that you will joining us in the upcoming webinars that we will announce hopefully soon. And again, thank you for everyone, and then hopefully we'll see you all again on our upcoming webinars. Thank you so much.